All right, welcome to another episode of the Scripting Den podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us, Ivan Fresneda. Hello, Ivan. Thank you for coming and please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Evan, and I am currently running a marketing agency, a growth marketing agency called My Content. And during the last 10 years, I've been working on Amazon and Google. So after some time in corporate, I decided to come back to my startup life, and that's why I decided to run this company, which is completely based on data, specifically for marketing.
Talking about how data influences, in some way, um, project development. Uh, and more specifically, I want to touch with you um, the connection between user feedback, actually, and analytics. So, kind of the qualitative and the quantitative aspects of it, and that connection and the role they play in the success of a software project. Let's call it that. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So you have some experience there, right?
Yeah, I have like some experience because I'm almost my entire life, I always remember when I was a kid and I started using, any type of software, even some web apps, some of the initial web apps or stuff like that. I was always thinking about okay, what's the best user journey? So as I continued, evolving in my career and I started working for Amazon and then Google and so on, I was able to see, how different companies, they were actually building, incredible web apps. And I was actually, curious on, okay, how are they actually taking these decisions? So at the beginning, of course, I was not involved in this aspect, but more and more I became involved on this. And I realized that many of those times that they were actually taking some decisions, sometimes they were not based purely based on data. They were kind of more based on qualitative feedback, which sometimes can actually give us a bad idea on what we should be changing. So that's why I actually became, quite interested on anything related to, development and data. And I actually, started, building, some of my first dashboards in order to actually get like some initial feedback. And something important that I was actually able to see is that I was able to see that, yeah, many times when we receive feedback, it's actually something that it doesn't give us the right answer. Sometimes the right answer is not something that we can, actually get from the user, but from the data. So that's why I became like super interested on this, and that's why I started getting like more conclusions. And when I was involved, on any, specifically on web apps, when I was involved in any particular web app project, I was actually, looking at web app data first, and then, the user feedback, but not the other way around, because all the experience that I had in the past actually, conclude me that, we were actually taking sometimes wrong decisions based on feedback instead of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see that. I mean, giving feedback, especially useful for product development, is not trivial. It's not something that anyone can do. User can tell you that they feel right about an app, or they don't, or they dislike a feature. But if they don't really give you the detail you need, you might just misinterpret that. It's just human communication at its best. Um, so if you're focusing first on data, on analytics, then let's focus on that first. What kind of metrics do you care about? What are you looking for first to figure out if there's anything that you have to work on, you have to like backtrack and fix, or change the plans and how? What are you looking for?
Okay, so the first thing is actually something that many people, I don't know why, but many people actually do not think, which is let's focus on volume. What I mean by volume, let's focus on those areas that have the highest interest by the users. And sometimes, when we are actually building, some marketing funnels, as an example, we can actually see that um, you may want to think about some specific sections of a website or a web app, which actually there are not that many visitors there. So your impact is not going to be huge if you are going to dedicate your time there.
Right.
So the very first thing I focus is, okay, let's define If this is important, let's define by the number of users who are going to potentially be impacted by this particular feature, with this particular change, and so on. So that's kind of my very first thing that I always take a look at.
Right.
Just because of many times I've seen, dedicating a lot of time to some particular sections of a website, of our web app, that do not have a lot of impact on the global sales, as an example of a project, right?
Yeah, I can see that. So essentially, the first thing to understand is what are people doing with your app, you know?
Yeah, that's it.
And figure out the biggest features, figure out the biggest sections, and then focus on that. And then what it would be the second indicator? What do you look for next? Once you figure
Cool.
out, what are people using the most?
Cool. In my case, what I also take a look at is the abandon rate. This is a metric that I love. So when there is one particular section that has a high abandon rate, something is going on there. For me, everything is kind of a funnel,
Right.
And something is not working. So I always focus on this particular metric, which is abandon rate. And that's kind of the first indicator that tells me, okay, this is something that people, are interested or not. People may be interested, here, but maybe they are not finding out what they were supposed to find. And that's why we need to actually, do like some exercise to understand, what happens here. And this is a key metric for me, because that's going to help me a lot to, focus on the right things, to focus on the areas that are going to have the highest importance. Because something that you don't want to have in your program is having users going to one particular section of your program and then suddenly, they just leave the program because they are frustrated or something like that.
Right. So that's interesting. So we're talking about, in general, like web apps, websites, and so on. But you haven't mentioned any of the classic metrics yet. You haven't really mentioned like time to first render, or you haven't really mentioned any really core technical metrics. So that's very interesting to me, because you're really focusing on trying to figure out the product side and the interaction with the user through metrics, but those are different, not the ones that developers are like used to focus on. Essentially, sometimes we're more focused on trying to get best performance, trying to get the fastest render or the lightest build or whatever, and that's kind of what we build around. But we're so essentially you will be saying that that's the wrong approach.
Yeah, because something that I also like to think is, you need to have in your mind what's potentially the user journey that any particular user may want to have on a web app, right? And this particular user journey is something that you are actually designing to actually complete. And if somebody is actually not following this particular user journey, for me, something is going on, and you actually need to see what's happening there. And I know that there are many KPIs and indicators that are super important, and I know that many guys are focusing on those KPIs. But for me, I actually prefer to start with my particular idea on how a user journey should be, and understand what's happening in this particular user journey, and understand how we can potentially improve this particular user journey. Because many times we put a lot of time on things that are not going to have a huge impact on your project. Like, let me give you an example, right? I mean, if your website is loading in, I don't know, 400 milliseconds versus 250 milliseconds, I know that there are a lot of studies out there that are saying, yeah, you're going to have, an increase in conversion rate by X% and so on. But, many of those studies actually, for me, are lacking of some important indicators that are actually, convincing me that this is going to be the most important thing for my case as well.
Right.
So that's why, at some point I decided to, okay, yeah, I know, 400 milliseconds is nice. I mean, it's okay. I mean, I'm not, super happy with that. But for me, if I focus my attention in some other factors, any tech team are going to be able to dedicate, their time in something that is going to have a much bigger impact than, as an example, reducing the load time by 100 milliseconds, as an example.
Yeah, I can see that. So what kind of so I'm curious what kind of tools you use to get these metrics, because this is not something that you would get with the standard set of tools from any developer or any um, I don't want to say software kit, but like the standard development environment that we set up to create web apps. I don't think we get the tools to figure out these metrics. So what are you using?
So in many projects, what we are actually doing are building our own in-house tools. And the reason why we do this is because with all this privacy craziness that has been happening during the last years, more and more we were actually detecting that we didn't have all the potential data that we needed to take the right call. So that's why we decided to start building server side in-house tools in order to actually understand what's going on and actually doing A/B testings based on that. So we decided to do this. I know, yeah, it's kind of it takes more time, right? I mean, to start actually, working, because you actually need to build, all your environment. But I detected that many of the tools that I was actually using, like Analytics, GA4, and so on, they were actually not providing me the right data that I needed. Or as an example, if you are actually doing something like, I don't know, as an example, we are using for a Shopify store, we actually have our web app, for some particular parts of the flow, user flow, right? And so we didn't have the right information with GA4, so we were actually not able to take the right calls with GA4. So at some point we were like, okay, yeah, let's build everything server side. This is going to be easier for us, and we are not going to need to dedicate a lot of time to actually implement third-party
Right.
tools that at the same time are going to be super expensive.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. You exchange that money on time, though. I mean, your team is now like also worried about maintaining and developing a new tool, but definitely gives you more flexibility. And what role does A/B testing play here? And also, kind of quickly describe what A/B testing is for those who don't know.
Yeah, so A/B testing is, when you're actually thinking something and you think like, okay, I think that this is going to be better for the user. So this is where A/B testing needs to be, in place. So anytime that you have, any hypothesis, as an example, any particular feature change or any particular something, for me, instead of just thinking or, discussing if this is going to be better or not with your team, it's kind of more about, okay, when are going to be testing this. So that's why we completely change the way that we work, and debating or just talking to each other about if this is going to be better or not. And we just thought, okay, why don't we just test everything?
Right.
So that's why creating our own in-house tools make a lot of sense, because now we are faster implementing any particular A/B testing. Now we can test, as an example, a color in a website. We can particularly test what's going on if I add any particular feature on a web app. As an example, user is going to click on there, user is going to spend more time there, user is going to, as an example, purchase anything else. So
Right.
everything related to that, it's something that we actually spend a lot of time, because that's actually the right information that we are actually looking for.
Sure. Yeah. And all right. Say you've been focusing on your data, on your analytics. You're doing A/B testing. When does user feedback actually come in?
So
Does it
the
at
feedback,
all?
no, it
Right.
does indeed. So I know that I've been saying that data is the most important factor, but for me, user feedback comes in when you actually don't know what to do. When you're actually lacking ideas, when ChatGPT is lacking ideas, this is the moment where the user feedback is super important. And at this particular moment, you will be amazed that this is actually another interesting part to actually start testing and actually start doing new A/B testings based on this particular user feedback. So that's why first of all, I trust A/B testing based on data. I also trust the funnel that has been a thought in order for the user to follow. And after all of this, of course, feedback needs to be taken into account. And feedback for me is not actually like reading and just thinking about it. Feedback
Right.
is, okay, this particular user says this, and 5 more users are actually saying something similar. So this is suggesting us to do this particular test. Okay, let's implement this test.
Okay. And how do you gather user feedback? Do you have like a
Okay, so
preferred method, a preferred tool, or just
yeah,
let it
so
organically reach you somehow?
so from me, the way that we gather feedback is, as an example, on a website. If somebody has been on a website by 10 minutes, as an example, this is a very good user from a point of view, and this particular user is going to trigger our tool to be suggesting him as a potential user to gather feedback.
All right.
So once the user is on the tool and the user reach one particular part of the website, the user is going to be able to provide us feedback there. We prefer to have feedback from users who know the tool more, because I discovered that users that do not know the tool, many times you need to filter this particular feedback. You actually didn't have all the information you needed, or maybe this particular user doesn't completely know what, a lot of things that are important, from us for the user to understand. So that's why we decided to do this particular part, to focus on those particular loyal users that, actually know us, better.
Interesting. But wouldn't you say that you're missing out there? Because users who are just ditching your application right away might be doing so because maybe they're lacking information, maybe they're lacking like, or let me put it the other way, you're not properly communicating how to use the application or what the application is supposed to do, or something like that. So essentially,
So absolutely. But there is, one component important that for me is also something that we spend a lot of time, is the quality of the traffic.
all right,
Traffic is not always perfect. And when you're actually sending traffic from, as an example, Facebook, or you're actually sending traffic from Google, sometimes you can be sending shitty traffic that is going to tell you nothing.
right,
And I can't justify, my time on something that I know for sure that this is actually not qualified traffic. And this particular user, actually clicked on the ad because we were a bit using, clickbait, tactics or things like that, or actually the, machine, wanted to show us on queries on Google that were not relevant to us, or
right.
stuff like that, right? So yeah, that's why I need somebody who spent more time, because if somebody is interested on weddings and this particular user is actually entering in a website dedicated to mobile phones, as an example,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
I can get a lot of information there. So that's why I don't want to blame my team on the software if we are actually not doing a good job on traffic.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And so would you say, because I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, but we never kind of reached this point yet. We haven't really reached this point yet, but we so far you've said, trust data, listen to users. Is there a connection? Is there like something that relates one to the other to the point where you say, well, actually, um, you can't really do proper software development without both?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we need to understand that you are listening to your users if you actually have the right data.
Right.
So this is, for me, the very basic point I forgot to tell you before, right? But if you have the right data, everything everything you need should be almost there, right? And anything else, besides that is something that, of course, is fantastic. But building the right pieces and building, and spending some time with your team, thinking about, okay, what's exactly the good metric that we want to track here, and taking a look at these particular KPIs and focusing on these particular KPIs and secondary KPIs is something that is going to help you a lot to take the right call. So yeah, qualitative feedback is super important, but there is a point where I got the impression that sometimes companies are actually asking the user some stuff that they shouldn't be asking. they should have this data already.
Right.
So this type of things, I mean, you don't need to, you shouldn't be, asking users, some stuff that you should already have, right? This is what we are actually trying to avoid.
That's fair. So, so what would you say are kind of the common challenges that you get or you face rather um, when dealing with this? When so you want to avoid asking questions to your users or wasting their time essentially on to gather data that you should be able to gather yourself. So what are the common challenges that as a development team you face when you're trying to like gather that feedback or that data rather, and then trying to incorporate whatever feedback you get out of it into into your app, rather whether it's a change on existing logic or a new feature or a new user flow or whatever.
So, I mean, some of the biggest challenges we face is that, first of all, time. The big challenge is here, okay, where should we focus our time? We should be focusing our time on this particular thing or this other thing, right? So first, prioritization, I think that this is the biggest thing by far, because of course, time, you can't have everything. Of course, once you have something, you are going to have that almost perfect in terms of data, but yeah, you need to dedicate time. And besides time, something that for me is important is not only defining our KPIs, but also defining the final goal. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
What do we want? Do we want users to, as an example, purchase something? Or do we want users to subscribe and have a recurrent subscription, as an example, right?
Right.
Do we want to focus more on recurrent buyers and lifetime value, or do we want to focus more on the overall return on investment, on a 30-day window? So stuff like that, it's something that I notice that can be challenging sometimes, because there is actually not the right answer. Sometimes you may want to focus on something, and sometimes you may want to focus on other things, right? And specifically when you are starting a new project, you don't know what's the best for the user. When you're actually starting a new project, you don't know, or for yourself, right? You don't know what is going to be better for your project and what's going to give you the overall biggest growth in the long run.
I mean, you probably have like guesses, but yeah, no certainty.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we have. I mean, sometimes we just need to guess, okay, this is going to be better for the user, so let's focus on this first. And 60 days later, you notice that, okay, there is like more buyers here, or maybe, there are lesser buyers. So yeah, based on that, you more or less know, if something was done right or not.
That's fair. What would you say then are kind of the best practices when it comes to like getting data and getting user feedback and trying to turn that into actions for your team?
Cool. So the very first thing is defining the tools that you're going to be using, and the budget you have for them. And what I mean by tools also means, do you have time and budget to build those tools by yourself? Do you need to go to the market and incorporate any third-party tool to your particular, A/B testing and user feedback analytics? Based on that, you actually need to start figuring out what you want to have, in the long run, as I said before, right? So do I want to have more sales in a year, or do I just want to have like more users, as an example, with maybe, a lower, cost per acquisition or stuff like that? So defining those particular final goals, I think that should be done before you actually define your KPIs, because sometimes the KPI is actually something that is not completely related to the goal. I mean, it's of course related, but yeah, not really in a direct way. So building those particular KPIs, and after that, for me, is time. You should really have enough data to take the right call. And many times I notice that many people are getting frustrated when they actually do not have enough sample to actually take one particular decision. Something, sometimes it's like, hey, this is not going well, let's stop this or something like that, right? At the end of the day, we need to think that any particular testing or any particular feedback that you want to incorporate in a software needs to have enough evidence. And in order to have enough evidence, even you need enough sample. But not only enough sample, you actually need a variety of different traffic channels, specifically for websites, because it's not the same sending out of users from Facebook, it's not the same sending out of users from an email, it's not the same sending out of users from Google, as an example.
I like that. So, and to follow up on that, so do you have some? And I'm guessing no, but maybe you'll surprise me. Do you have like some sort of threshold or metric that you look at to say, all right, so we do have right now, uh, now is the time where we actually have enough data to analyze it and make a decision. Before that, let's just wait, keep getting data, because we can really make a call or change a feature based on two users, for example. And when do you say, okay, that's enough, let's now analyze this and see what we get out of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, you need to have statistical evidence, and yeah, I mean, we are here are more or less technical, right? But sometimes you need to convince people, to have statistical evidence in order to take the right call. So that's something important. Sometimes you need to convince your team to wait and trust the sample. But then when it comes to threshold, I would say that you also need to have enough knowledge of the different traffic channels that you're actually using for your app, right? And you can take the right call if you have enough statistical evidence on something and enough sample. If you are only using one particular sample, because there is a lot of users, but for me, you need to have enough users from any traffic channel, not only as an example email, which is something that can give you the right idea at the very first time, right? So this is more or less something that I would say that is very important when you're incorporating the user feedback there. And after that, it's just about matter of defining metrics, defining what's the next step, implementing, which is something important, right, when it comes to best practice, implementing, and of course prioritization on the implementation of the different features and different action items that you were able to take. And for me, when we are talking about implementation, we are talking about the implementation. For me is something that we are talking about also a prioritization job, and you just need to figure out what's going to be what's going to have the biggest impact to the user, and based on that prioritize those particular new elements that needs to be incorporated and start building those.
All right. Do you have something you can share, a story you can share, where you used this data, this user feedback to improve a product, something that something, I don't want to say interesting, but rather something that stuck with you because of some particular reason?
So I have very interesting story. In one of the projects, there was an e-commerce website, and we built kind of a personalized user journey way for the customers, so they can actually choose the box they needed to fill out with different items of the website, right? And something that we did is, okay, we want to give the users the opportunity to choose between the small and big box. Based on that, they will need to fill the box with the different items of the website, and they will know for sure how much is going to be this particular box. Yeah. Something that we were able to say by data is that the users actually didn't want to know the price before actually filling out a box. They were actually wanting to go straight to the product, go straight to start filling out a box, and if for whatever reason they find out they want more items that, a small box as an example, they preferred to get switched automatically to the bigger box and being charged more based on that. And yeah, this is something that we were always thinking like, hey, if we are 100% honest with them and we tell them the price, right before, they were actually start, the buying process, they will potentially be more loyal to us. They will see us as super clear. And yeah, I mean, we are actually clear to them and crystal clear in terms of pricing and so on. But yeah, we noticed that, we needed to remove, one step that for most of them, they were like, oh yeah, I don't want that. And actually more people were able to purchase more items if they were not actually choosing their box.
Interesting. And do you remember how you got to that conclusion? Was it user feedback or was it data? Was it a combination of those?
Oh, was data. Was actually only data. It was like super clear. 30% more people were actually adding at least one item if we were removing the box selection. So yeah, 30% more people on the first step, and then it was like a crazy number. The number of purchases we were actually getting more just by removing, the size box. So yeah, this was, one big element that you actually do not need to talk to the customer to actually see that they prefer they prefer this method. Because if you talk to the customer, I mean, I can guarantee you that many of them are going to say, I love that you are actually giving me the opportunity to choose the right box and pricing and having all this data beforehand. But yeah, the data was telling us something completely different.
Interesting. All right, I think that we're getting close to the end, so I want to end this with one last question. Let's say this is your podcast. What would be the number one advice that you would want your audience to leave after listening to this episode?
Keep trying. You won't get the final conclusion on the very first step or the very first try. You will need to keep trying, and you will need to actually spend like some time until you get your first good change in terms of software development. And your very first winning is going to take like some time to get. But once you are there, a lot of success is going to be following. So yeah, don't get desesperated. Just keep trying, keep doing your stuff, and results are going to be there, sooner or later.
Awesome. Fantastic advice. All right. That's it. Thank you, Ivan, again for joining us and sharing a bit of your own wisdom about this topic. Can you share with our audience where they can find you online and how they can reach out to you?
Absolutely. So they can find me online on X and Instagram at IvanFC. And yeah, that's my username. So that's where I put, some of my thoughts and so on. I actually put like more stuff on Instagram nowadays, kind of more in a video way.
All right.
But yeah, in X, sometimes I actually, post like some stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. I'll make sure to add those links to the show notes so people can click on it and find you. All right. That's it, folks. Thank you again, Ivan. And thanks everyone for listening. And I'll catch you on the next one. Bye. And that was it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to rate the podcast in your favorite podcasting app so that it can reach more developers. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter or X, as people call it, just look for me at DeleteMan123. And that's it. Thank you and catch you on the next one.